topic is threat assessment, and then the second question is do cEDH decks actually run targeted removal, or do they just go burp? So I'm going to answer the second one real quick because it's pretty cut and dry, and then we can talk about threat assessment. All right. So to answer that question, cEDH decks do run targeted removal. They run a lot of interaction on the stack and things that interact with the board. Currently, a lot of that tends to be in the form of bounce spells, due to the fact that not only can you use them to remove threats out of the way, but you can also do things like bounce a dockside, reset a rock, things like that. Since right now, currently, cEDH generally tends to be a lot more spell slinger centric, based on the fact that red is so powerful right now in the form of Underworld Breach and Dockside Extortionist and the free interaction that's been printed. I think that about covers that part. So you guys want to talk about threat assessment a little bit now?
Yeah. So for me, there are 3 pieces to threat assessment. And before I get into that, let me just give a disclaimer. Everyone is bad at threat assessment. Like, even if somebody says they're good at it, everyone sucks at it. It is okay to be bad at it. You're going to punt a lot of games because of poor threat assessment. Everyone does. Yeah, it just happens. Like, it's part of playing a multiplayer game. Yeah. So with that in mind, the 3 pieces of threat assessment in my mind come down to this. 1, what are you doing? 2, what are your opponents doing? And 3, what on the board is influencing that? If you know what you're doing, you are going to have a pretty clear idea of what on the board is causing you a problem. That alone isn't good enough to make a decision, because you also have to know what your opponents are doing. So, for example, if you're playing a fast deck like, say, Gitrog, and you've got a Abrupt Decay in hand, and there's a Rule of Law on the table, you're going to probably want to get rid of that Rule of Law. But
very important.
If the guy playing before you or after you is on a Turbo Nose list, you probably want to be pretty careful about when you play that Rule of Law. Because if you take out, say, a rule, or when you play that Abrupt Decay to take out the Rule of Law, because if you take out a Rule of Law, you're unlocking everybody else. So the question becomes, is this a bigger benefit to me, or am I benefiting, player 3 when I kick player 2 in the kneecap?
Right. Yeah. Salt factor. So, like, Cricket, you got any thoughts on threat assessment?
Well, I mean, it's funny that they bring that up, because it goes back to some of the discussions we've had earlier and in other streams about spike plays and how that affects threat assessment. So, really it does boil down to, is this going to progress my board? Is this going to help me get to my win? Or am I doing this because I'm pissed off at the person? And so, like, there's just so many nuances to threat assessment, and there's never a good answer. Like, getting rid of a Gilded Drake is not always the right answer every game, which is what makes threat assessment that much more difficult, because it's this, and I might get rid of the Rule of Law this game, but leave it for the entire game this next one.
Right.
So it's really just ultimately assessing each game as it comes and really thinking to yourself, does this help me more than it is stopping my opponents?
Right. Well, yeah. So, like, one of the biggest things with threat assessment, like, the blatant obvious stuff is, like, for me, sometimes threat assessment will look screwy, but it's part of the plan. Like, if I'm playing against somebody who is playing a deck with a really high curve, they're really choked on mana, they're and I'm hedging a bet, or I'm taking a calculated risk. Like, let's say they play Adnaz in main phase and they're tight on mana and tight on cards and tight on everything, right? They're not at, like, a real high life total. I might not interact with that Adnaz based on the calculated risk that they're going to have a pretty reasonable chance of whiffing on it, as an example. Or that maybe I notice an onboard trick, like in my MLC game where Ian cast his Adnos, and then I had the onboard trick of untapping somebody's Deathrite Shaman to kill him at 2 life. I kept my mouth shut. I let it resolve. I just kept my cool. I messaged Plam and I was like, don't keep that mana open. And it worked out, but I was taking a calculated risk, like to not like untap that so that way he could use that to cast a counter spell to do that same trick. Or something of that type of nature. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But on paper, like that may look like I had poor threat assessment until after the fact. Mm-hmm. Or there's times where like I will get tunnel vision and I just won't notice something on the board, and I'll be like as a good, as a reasonably decent player, like I'll try to think about what I'm going to do on my turn while my opponents are fetching and doing things, but then they might have done something in between that I didn't really like pay very deep attention to. So therefore I might sequence incorrectly based on that and then walk into something. I've done that before. But overall, it's just trying to have like, it's not that people won't make mistakes. It's to try to, like discuss like what was the correct thing to do? What was the optimal thing to do? What was the strongest, like what was the best course of action? Like obviously it didn't work out for me because I ain't winning. I didn't win. But I can learn from it and I can use it to kind of improve upon the next game. Mm-hmm. And with that kind of in mind as a large part of the competitive mindset, that after that post-game dialogue amongst my play group or players who are also equally, and sometimes it can kind of be kind of heady, kind of critiquey, but that's fine. Mm-hmm. Like I would expect it from my friends, and I'm not saying they got to like keep shoving it down, but like bring it up. Like, you really punted that one hard and you probably should have done this, or this, or I think this would have been the better line and it would have worked out. And
sometimes the state of the game changes. Like what is the correct play in the moment might end up being something that costs you later on, but there's no way you can know that. Right.
Right.
Right. Another thing is
somebody might be sandbagging and I didn't think they had anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that happened in my most recent, well, not my most recent MLC game, but one of my MLC games a couple weeks ago, where we were under a rule of law. It was my turn. I had cast my spell. Deke went for a bounce spell at the end of my turn, and it turned out that Ashani just had the instant speed win that he needed in hand, which, we had talked about it, we had discussed it, and if I had had the read that he had it, I would have kept up interaction because I had some. But
or maybe I think people have it and they don't, and then I'm like, shit, I shouldn't have passed them. I sandbagged so hard.
And part of threat assessment is also like understanding what an opponent is on. Like, if an opponent's playing Adnos, maybe you attack them if they're open. Like, it's usually going to benefit you.
And if you really want to get into the absolute dredges of getting better at threat assessment, a couple of things you can do is if you're playing a vast majority of your games online, record all your games and take notes afterwards. Look at board states, look at people's play patterns, and determine where you might have seen a tell and not recognize it at a time and file that away later. If you're playing mostly in person, when the game ends, teach yourself your own version of shorthand and just scribble down in a notebook everything that you remember from that game. And what that does is it helps you recognize play patterns and helps you better learn threat assessment, if that makes sense. Yeah. Because it's like you're studying It's like how football players will watch games from the past to learn how to
teams.
Right. To learn
Yeah.
tactics and play styles so that they can capitalize in future games.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've played so many games with Jamaican that I can basically, like, I can tell you when he's setting up and when he has it and when he doesn't. Like, even beyond him sometimes. And he's the same way with me. Like, he knows if I ain't got shit. And he's like, you got 5 win cons in your hand. Ha ha ha. You know, and like, can just call it. Like, you just kind of pick it up. But for me, one of the big things with threat assessment is, one, being willing to be teachable. 2, seeking out that conversation after the game, like, you know, like maybe like talking about a play, like I wasn't sure what to do there, or I did this, maybe I should have done that. And then other people will just kind of, especially if you initiate it, they will give you their thoughts, and they may or may not be right, but you know, something to think about.
That's another skill that goes along with this, is figuring out who is thinking about things in a way that is useful and who is talking out the side of their neck.
Yeah. All right. You guys want to move on to the next one?